Hi, I'm Eddie of Eddie's Reef of Korea. Today's weekly video is going to be on water changes. I actually split it in two parts. The first part is going to be when should you do a water change, and then the second part is how should you do a water change. So I hope you enjoyed this video, you find it interesting, and go ahead and subscribe to my channel. Hit that like button and press the notification. So let's take a deep dive and check it out. Hold on. Okay, so here we are focused at the actual items that I'm going to talk about when it comes to water changes. Right next to me I have the laptop. My laptop, I went ahead and did bullet points, like all of you that follow me know that when I do a research, this is what I actually do first. Okay, now first part, of course, I'm going to talk about when should you actually do a water change. Okay, one thing, always ask yourself why. The very simple one word question, why? Why do I need a water change? Now, something that I found out from experience, many years in this hobby, and looking at other YouTube channels and all that, don't go by others. And again, I stress this very highly, do not go by others. For instance, I do a water change weekly, or I do a water change every other week. Now others that inform how much water change and how many times they do it, you should ask why. Now this is what I'm getting at. When you go to different channels, and YouTube channels of course, and you look at these gorgeous reefs, and then they'll talk about, you know, they'll narrate about their tanks and all that. No, I do weekly water changes. Great. Okay, what I'm referring to in these bullet points, to reiterate, to amplify more what I wrote down as an outline, is why? Why do they do a weekly water change? Of course, usually they won't tell you. They won't tell you that they need to do a weekly water change because their nutrient levels are so high because of the amount of corals that they have, especially if it's SPS, especially sticks, that they have to do a weekly water changes. Now the other population or group of people that do bi-weekly water changes or monthly water changes, well, why do they do it? Well, they won't tell you that because they have low nutrient values, then they really don't need to do weekly water changes. So this is what I'm referring to. Just because Joe Blow says that I do weekly water changes, don't go ahead and do weekly water changes on your tank, not unless if it's actually necessary. Now, going down on the bullet points is what you should do. I highly recommend this, and I do it every weekly. Do testing. Test your NO3, of course, that's the nitrates, and then test your PO4, which is the phosphates. These are your indicators when it comes to nutrients in your tank. Now, what I mean by nutrients, of course, fish poop, the amount of food that you're feeding your fish, and also your corals. Now, you have to check and make sure that they are within what's called, you know, what I actually call it, the allowable nutrient range for your type of reef. Now, based on testing, then this will decide either to do a water change or not do an actual water change. Now, also, upon testing, it will also tell you the amount of water that you should actually change. Now, what I mean by this, if, let's say, you see that your nutrient levels, which I'm going to go into it now, which we're talking about the nitrates and the phosphates. This is how I check my nitrates. The phosphates, I check them with a Hannah checker, and I also double check it with a Salifer test kit. This is what I use for my nitrates. Now, by what I mean by that is, for instance, if your phosphates, in my case, I have a mixed reef. So a good target, I would say it's around 10. If you have, well, actually 0.10, I say 10, but 0.10 or a little less, then you're in target. If your nitrates are 8 or 10, you're also in target. Now, what I'm trying to explain to make the decision to do a water change, if, like, for instance, let's say that your phosphates are at 0.25, which is what I had about a week and a half ago. But yet, my nitrates were about 8 or 5. So what do? Well, I definitely do need to do a water change because my PO4, my phosphates were a bit high. But the message that I'm trying to get out there is that don't do a 20 or 50% water change. Because if you do that, then you're going to put your phosphates at 0 and your nitrates also at 0. And that's what you're trying to avoid in the new school of thought, that you have to have nutrients, in other words, NO3 and PO4s for the corals to eat. That's what they eat. You always must have, shall we call it, a dirty tank, not a sterile tank with 0, 0, 0. I know that you're going to say, well, Eddie, wait a minute. I go to other channels and I see beautiful reefs and they say they have NO3s 3 or 4 or 0 and the PO4 are 0. Yeah, but possibly they have it at 0 when they checked because it consumed, the corals consumed all of the nitrates and phosphates. But when you test, you always should have some trace amount of phosphates and nitrates. Now, when it comes to, like, let's say the salinity, which I actually check my salt with a refractometer, you should target, I would say, a vicinity of 1.026. Now, that's more or less the broad range of what you should have in your reef when it comes to the salinity of your water. So what I'm trying to explain now is that, like, for instance, let's say that when you check your tank water, you are at 1.026. Well, then you go ahead and when you do your prepared water, you would do it also at 1.026. But let's say that when you check your water in your reef, it's at 1.021 or 22. Well, what that means is that then when you prepare your new water, you actually should do it higher than 1.026, like let's say 1.030, to compensate. So when you put that 5, 10, 15, or 20% water, when you change that water, it will elevate it actually to the target, which is 1.026. And then the reverse holds true. If you're running, when you check your reef water, if you see that you're at 1.030 or 1.028, well, when you do your prepared water, don't do it at 1.026, do it less. Do it, let's say, at 1.022 or 1.020. So when you introduce your prepared water, your water change, then it'll bring it down to the actual 1.026. Now, moving along, one final thing that I thought I mentioned on the topic of when to do a water change. When you're ready to do the water change, you have your prepared water, you're good to go. Okay, one thing that they recommend that you should do is try to keep the temperature of your water in your reef and your prepared water as close as possible. For instance, example, my temperature is 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So when I prepare my water, I try to shoot for that temperature. Now, it doesn't have to be exactly that temperature. You can have a deviation of, I'd say, 3 degrees. Like when you prepare your water, it can be 3 degrees higher or 3 degrees lower. But it doesn't have to be exact. More than that, you might actually shock your corals when you introduce that water change. And then when it comes to pH, this is what I use for my pH, the Salifer test kit. So like, for instance, I check my pH on my reef is 8.0. So when I check my water, it should be more or less that range. And again, like I said, when it came to the temperature, and here now the pH, it doesn't have to be exactly 8.0, 8.0. You can use within that range deviation of 3 increments. So like if I have 8.0 and let's say on the prepared salt, I have 8.10 or 8.2, you're fine. You're good to go. So that's something that I thought I'd bring up. And then an observation, a final note before we go into how I actually do the water changes, or in general how people do water changes. This is something very important, and it's a note. If you do regular water changes, you should not need to add trace elements. Because, why? Well, because when you do water changes, you replenish and you put in check all of your trace elements. So if you're doing like a regular water changes, like weekly or bi-weekly, or even monthly, you really don't need to add trace elements. Trace elements are really, really geared for people that barely do water changes more than 1 month or even longer, once a year, 6 months or whatever. Then, you know, because of the corals and fish in, you know, your whole reef in general consuming, but especially the corals, consuming all those nutrients, and then you have your protein skimmer also that is skimming, is taking out things from the water. Then if you wait a long time to do water changes, then in that case, then I would use, in my case, I use Replenish from Brightwell Aquatics. But if you do regular water changes like weekly or bi-weekly, upon what I just mentioned, that when you check your nutrient levels, you see that they're a bit high, so you should do a water change. Based also on the amount of your nutrients, then that's when you make a decision if you do a 5%, 10 or 20%. But going back to what I'm talking about on this note that I thought I mentioned, again, I'll reiterate. If you're doing regular water changes, weekly, bi-weekly, whatever, you do not need to introduce trace elements because you are replenishing them when you go ahead and you do your water changes. So now I'm going to change the things that are here, and I'm going to show you when it comes how should you do a water change. So hold on 1 second while I set up for the camera. Okay, now here, this is what I use to do my water change. I have a bucket. This is from Reef Crystals, but it's an empty bucket. You know, the salt that I use is Tropic Marin. But this is the empty bucket that a friend of mine gave me, and you know, it's certified like for foods and vegetables, so there's no chemical or something that would be distilled if I prepare the water. So in my case, being 40 gallons, the Reef, but you know, like let's say like 10% or 20% is in this tank, of course, minus bioload. You know, what I do, and when it comes to changing water, it's between 3 or 5 gallons of water. So what I do is I go ahead and I fill this container with RODI, and then I mix my Tropic Marin. And then of course I have the hose, and then I use a pump. So for reefs, I'd say like this one that I have, like a 40 or 75 or something. I personally, again, the disclaimer, this is me, Eddie, of Eddie's Reef Aquaria. This is what I would use. I mean, it's not a big deal, a bucket, you know, with a pump. Now, if it was a small tank like my Aquastyle 9, the one that I decommissioned way back, but that's a 9-gallon tank. So in that case, you really don't need to use a pump and all and a hose. What you do is just, you get like a 1 gallon or a 2 gallon little bucket. You stir the salt. You make sure that everything's and check, like I mentioned on this video previously, and you go ahead and you take out, very important, the same amount of water that you take out, of course, should be the same amount of water that you're going to introduce on your water change. So I go ahead and do that. So if it's a small tank, bucket would be more than enough. You know, I'm referring without the pump. Just, you know, you have a second bucket, you take out, let's say, a gallon of water, and then on another gallon, empty bucket, you prepare the salt, the new salt that you're going to introduce, and you go ahead and change it. But in my case, being that, you know, do a water change on this tank is like close to 5 gallons, then this bucket is more than enough. So I go ahead, I prepare this, but, you know, I'm not going to go ahead and get on a ladder and tumble this when I take out the 3.5 or 4 gallons of water, get on a ladder and empty the actual bucket. So what I do is, to make it more comfortable, I just go ahead. Matter of fact, this is the stock pump that came with a actual Reef, but since I modified it to a CG 2.0, I kept this pump, and this is the one that I actually put it inside and mix the salt, and then I go ahead, I put it inside facing up like you see, put the hose, and I go ahead and I do my water change. Well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video, found it educational, informative, and fun. So go ahead and don't forget to subscribe to my channel, smash that like button and notification button. And as I say at the end of all of my videos, happy reefing, thanks for watching, and until next time, bye-bye.